Yes!
Where we currently stand, we're roughly 4 months away from the release of the Witch Queen expansion, and there's a lot of interesting things happening with this DLC. The Hive are apparently able to utilize light just like us, and we're getting a new weapon type known as the Glaive. But I would be lying to myself if I said that I wasn't excited about weapon crafting the most. Bungie hasn't said much about how weapon crafting will work, but the other night I couldn't sleep because I couldn't stop brainstorming ideas and my brain was overflowing with concepts regarding how a weapon crafting system would function in Destiny 2. So, with all that out the way, let's go ahead and get it in. Let's kick things off by addressing the elephant in the room. Why does Destiny 2 need a weapon crafting system? Well, for those of us that played Destiny 1, you might remember the Reforging system, something that behaved like a very early version of weapon crafting. Now, Reforging was introduced in Destiny 1's second DLC known as House of Wolves, and simply by talking to the Gunsmith and paying 250 Glimmer, 3 weapon parts, and a Motor Light, you could re-roll all the perks of a legendary weapon. There was no option to individually pick and choose the perks to re-roll, so if you decide to reforge a weapon, all of the perks will reset simultaneously. When this system was announced, I was happy to know that it would be an option in the game, but I immediately knew that it would have some drawbacks, and it definitely did. Even though there was no guarantee that you would ever get the exact roll that you wanted, if you had enough of the required materials to keep reforging, you could eventually get a good roll. And back in year 1 of Destiny 1, RNG was at its highest levels of brutality. So if you were able to get a roll that was perceived as decent, at least, you were still considered to be lucky. The cruelty of RNG was a lot more apparent in the vanilla and dark below eras of Destiny 1 because legendary loot drop rates were insanely low and exotic drops were almost as likely as a Bigfoot sighting. So by the time House of Wolves released, most if not all the aforementioned problems were mediated, and Reforging was meant to reduce the game's prevalence of RNG. Bungie's intentions were good, but things ended up backfiring because around this time, Efrideet Spear, a sniper rifle from the Iron Banner, was a very popular weapon in PvP because it had access to a perk known as Final Round. This perk increased the damage of the final round of a weapon's magazine by 33%, and combined with the Efrideet Spear belonging to the highest impact archetype of sniper rifles, this weapon was able to kill almost any Guardian with one shot to the body. Of course, everybody has their sniper scope preferences, but would it really make a difference if you had a weapon that could kill with a single shot to the body? On top of that, Efrideet Spear had a 3-round magazine, so in the beginning of every round of Trials of Osiris, you would hear everybody firing off 2 shots and deliberately going for body shots. So yeah, when it came to re-rolling Efrideet Spear, the only perk that made a difference was Final Round. Aside from Efrideet Spear, the 340 RPM pulse rifle Hopscotch Pilgrim was a menace in PvP, and I'm pretty sure everybody was reforging this weapon as well. As expected, Reforging didn't make it into the Take a King expansion, the content released after House of Wolves, and all year 1 weapons and armor were sunset. Reforging was a good concept, but it had innumerable shortcomings, mostly since Bungie was still figuring out what to do with Destiny 1 back then. Most if not all the mistakes Bungie made happened in Destiny 1, and even though a lot of stupid decisions were made in the first year of Destiny 2, Bungie eventually figured out what they needed to do for the game to succeed. Reforging was a method to combat RNG and give players more options in terms of how their weapons performed. These options were limited, but still provided some peace of mind of knowing that you could re-roll a terribly rolled weapon. It was to no surprise that this system was able to be exploited, but the goal was to provide us with more freedom. I believe that Bungie has things all figured out now, so let's talk about how the weapon crafting system might work in Destiny 2. All Destiny players have their favorite weapons, legendary and exotic. Exotic weapons are unique and or one of a kind, but legendary weapons have always been special because of their access to random rolls. And as a Destiny player, if you've ever developed a strong enough attachment to a weapon, you probably farm for it. If you're a long-time viewer of this channel, you're probably aware of how much I love the 540 RPM pulse rifle Horus Lease, and if you aren't, you can check on my channel to see because there's a handful of videos of me using that weapon and talking about it. Horus Lease is the strike exclusive weapon from the Nightfall version of the Corrupted Strike, and I probably farmed this strike a million times before I got the roll I was looking for. I learned all the ins and outs of this strike, and I even put together a guide on how to speed run it in 7 minutes or less. Eventually, a Horus Lease dropped for me with L-Hair Break, Ricochet rounds, rangefinder, kill clip, and a reload speed masterwork. I couldn't have asked for better perks, but the masterwork was a literal eyesore because it provided nothing to the weapon. Unfortunately, I was stuck with it because legendary weapons lost the ability to reroll masterwork traits in year 2. In year 1, we could reroll weapon masterworks, but this was an option during an era where legendary weapons had static rolls and single trait perks, so the ability to reroll masterworks back then wasn't the most amazing thing in the world, if I'm being honest. I hope that Destiny 2's weapon crafting system doesn't simply allow us to reroll masterworks because I would want all masterwork traits to be converted into mods. This makes perfect sense because we already have adept mods in the game that function very similarly to masterwork traits, so why shouldn't all masterworks be mods? Adept weapons would benefit from this the most because you would be able to slot an Adept Masterword mod and still have another mod slot freed up for something else. A Stability Masterword would add a total of 10 extra points of stability to a weapon, while the Adept Stability mod also adds plus 10 to the stability stat. If all Masterword traits were mods, an Adept Stability Masterword would add plus 20 to the stability stat. If all Masterword traits were converted into mods, this would make the most sense if all legendary weapons dropped with an empty Masterword slot. The last time we were able to pick the Masterwords for our weapons was back in Season 7 with the Menagerie release, so it's apparent that Bungie was trying to provide the fan base with more weapon customization options. And I speak for everybody when I say that a terrible Masterword always ruins any weapon, even if all the other perks are perfect. Whether you're after weapons with perfect or just satisfactory rolls, everything boils down to RNG. You could do an activity one time and get the weapon roll that you were looking for versus your friend who has the world's worst RNG, who probably farmed the same activity over 1,000 times and still hasn't dropped the roll he's looking for. We're so in the habit of instantly dismantling a weapon if it rolled terribly and or if it's not the roll we're after. I have a funny feeling that the new weapon crafting system will make it so that even the most terribly rolled weapons will still matter, and I'll explain how. Okay, so I have a Darkest Before with chamber compensator, small bore, extended mag, armor piercing rounds, tunnel vision, unrelenting, and a stability masterwork. If there were 3 things I could change about this roll, I would swap extended mag for ricochet rounds, small bore for arrowhead break, and unrelenting for fully auto. I ended up getting another Darkest Before that rolled pretty terribly. However, this one has arrowhead break, one of the barrel options that I said that I wanted. I always imagined a system where we could dismantle a weapon and transfer one of its perks to another weapon, but both weapons would have to be the exact same. If this was the case, I would be able to scrap the terribly rolled Darkest Before and grant its arrowhead break perk to another Darkest Before. Again, I would want this to be a possibility for duplicate weapons only. I personally think that this is fair because weapon and armor infusion is the process of assimilating the power level of one weapon into another, and this means that duplicate drops of the same weapons wouldn't go to waste unless they just so happen to not feature any perks that you're after. You know how excited we get when a perfectly rolled weapon drops? Imagine that same level of excitement when you drop another version of a weapon you currently own simply because it rolled one perk that you were after. You could collect several different versions of the same weapon and take one perk from each one until you were finally able to build your dream roll. But Destiny wouldn't be Destiny if there wasn't some sort of grind involved. It's obvious that you would need some sort of currency to perform this action and expect the price increase every time you change the weapon's perks. I'm not asking for the new weapon crafting system to be a build a god roll workshop. I just want to receive some sort of benefit from every weapon drop, even if they have the most horrible perks. In the past, I've managed to drop some amazingly rolled shotguns, but instead of range masterworks, I was always given reload speed or stability. I hate when any of my weapons drop with reload speed masterworks, but admittedly, I would take that over stability any day when it comes to shotguns because stability does absolutely nothing for shotguns. And my Horror's Lease that I brought up earlier could have had a range of stability masterwork, especially considering how heavily 540 RPM pulse rifles rely on having the most optimal stats to perform well, especially in comparison to the other pulse rifle archetypes. This weapon's reload speed masterwork never gave me any issues, but the realization that things could have been better is what always bothered me the most. This is all speculative, but I decided to save all of my terribly rolled weapons with 1 or 2 good perks on the off chance that this feature becomes a part of the weapon crafting system, and I suggested you do the same thing. And even if this doesn't happen, it's not that big of a deal because you can simply dismantle your weapons later. I've never been that big of a fan of the Call of Duty series, but I've always enjoyed the creative freedom when it comes to weapons. In games like Call of Duty and Rainbow Six, you have the option to change the sights, barrels, magazines, etc. of your weapons. In Destiny 2, we've only ever been able to change our weapons shaders and mods, and things were even worse in D1 because mods didn't exist back then and shaders couldn't be applied to weapons. So yeah, it's about time the weapon system in Destiny 2 received a facelift. Over the course of the game's lifespan, the armor system has been updated at least 2 or 3 times, but aside from random rolls returning for weapons released year 2 and beyond, weapon customization has remained relatively the same for the past couple of years. I've never had an issue with the random attribute or trait perks, but it never made sense for barrel sights and masterwork traits to be random as well. Accompanying this, I never understood why some weapons have barrel perks and some have sight perks. Why can't they just have both? This always annoyed me because what happens when you find a weapon you really like but you absolutely detest its scope or sights, but you can't change it because it only has access to barrel options? Well, I'll tell you, you either have to deal with it or find another weapon because you're stuck with that sight option. But what if that wasn't the case? What if you could do something about it? This needs to happen because in terms of stat increase and benefits, sight-based weapons always offer less than barrel-based weapons. Let's take a look at Better Devils and Outstringer. Both of these weapons are 140 RPM hand cannons, but Better Devils has access to sights, while Outstringer has access to barrels. I'm using a website known as D2 Gunsmith to simulate the stats of both of these weapons to see how they stack up against one another. So for this test, we're gonna go all in on range since that's the most important stat for hand cannons. Let's start off by adding a range masterword and accurize rounds to both weapons. But now let's look for the sight and barrel options that grant the biggest range bonus. That would be full bore for Outstringer and sure shot HCS for Better Devils, and this is where the entire game changes. Better Devils ends up with a total of 73 points in the range stat compared to Outstringer's 83, but with that big of a range boost, the sight and barrel options deduct a few points from the other stats. Full bore adds 14 range and cuts handling by 5 and stability by 9, while sure shot HCS adds 9 range and 5 aim assists, but the stability stat loses 9 points and handling loses 8. It's easy to see that the benefits of sure shot HCS are less than that of full bore, and even though Outstringer's base range is 5 points higher than Better Devils, you could deduct 5 points from Outstringer's range stat and it would still be higher than Better Devils range stat, but it gets worse than that. All the Better Devils sight options use the same exact icon, so if you're in search for a specific sight to roll in your weapon, you won't know which ones you got until you scroll over them and inspect them. Sight options provide very nominal stat increases, especially in comparison to barrel options, and sight options only ever provide bonuses to range, handling, and target acquisition, as far as I'm concerned. I wanted to shed some light on 2 sniper rifles I'm very fond of, Iron Banner's Bite of the Fox and Gambit Prime Soul Survivor. I've always enjoyed using these snipers, but I absolutely detest the chevron in their scopes. For some odd reason, I always struggle to hit my shots with these weapons because it's always a completely different story when I'm using a sniper scope with a dot instead. That's a very small gripe, but the option to swap sniper scopes would be heaven sent. There are a handful of weapons and archetypes that'll perform well no matter what purse they roll with, while certain weapons rely too heavily on rolling the right barrel and magazine options to perform at their best. And I wanted to mention that I'm very likely to become consumed by unrelenting disappointment when I see the following. Number 1, a shotgun without rifle barrel or full choke, accurized rounds, and a range masterword. Range is the most important stat on the shotgun. Handling is just as important, hence why quick draw is a highly sought after perk for shotguns. A 540 or 450 RPM lightweight pulse rifle without arrowhead break, chamber compensator, and or extended barrel, ricochet rounds or steady rounds, as well as a range or stability masterwork, is an instant dismantle for me. If you play Destiny 2 on console, stability and recoil direction are the 2 most important stats for pulse rifles. The 540 RPM and 450 RPM lightweight pulse rifles are the fastest firing pulse rifles and rely more heavily on stability and recoil direction to comfortably compete. And while we're still on the topic of modular weapon attachments in Destiny 2, there's something that I want to point out. What does Crimson, Red Death, and Monte Carlo all have in common? I don't have to tell you this because it's pretty obvious, but it always bothered me that the bayonets on these weapons are completely aesthetic, and that's it. I've seen countless posts on Reddit and the Bungie forums where community members will express their annoyance of this. I understand that Destiny is a T-rated game, and I'm not asking for us to be able to run enemies through with a bayonet, but it would be great if they did something. One of my favorite weapons from year 1, the Atalanta D submachine gun, had a suppressor, and to no surprise at all, it was purely cosmetic. I don't know how convoluted things would become if we had a super in-depth weapon customization system, but I would never want Destiny 2 to become anything like a military shooter because I don't think that would fit the identity of the game. I would simply want all the amazing looking weapon attachments to have some sense of functionality. Okay, so let's recap. For the weapon crafting system, I asked for interchangeable weapon sights, barrels, and masterwords, as well as weapons having access to sight and barrel options instead of one or the other. I would also like it if we could move one perk from one weapon to another, provided that both weapons are the same, and the weapon that offered one of its perks will be dismantled. I'm looking forward to the weapon crafting system, and I hope that some of my ideas end up coming true. Well, everybody, that does it for this one. In the comment section, tell me if you're excited for the Witch Queen, weapon crafting, and the new glaive weapon type. If you made it to the end of this video and enjoyed what you watched, do me a favor and thumb rest to that like button until it turns blue. And if you're new to my neck of the woods, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and click that bell icon so you don't ever miss a video of the most elite gaming content. But with that being stated, 1LHD is over and out. Y'all take it easy.
Can redeem you and me. Don't you wanna feel something? And oh, I miss loving you, but I need to live my own truth. I wanna feel it all brand new. I found a little something from Miss Angelou. Take the good and hold it near to you, and let go of all the burdens you